Hello, everyone. I'm Mary Kate Saliva, your host for Veteran Voices. I'm super excited, and we have an incredible guest here on the show today. Just a quick programming note before we get started. And again, welcome to all to Veteran Voices. Veteran Voices, you can get wherever you get your podcast from, and we are proudly part of the Supply Chain Now family. We are also in proud partnership with the Guam Human Rights Initiative, a nonprofit that's near and dear to my heart. You can learn more about this incredible organization and the work that they're doing at guamhri.org. And again, Veteran Voices is all about interviewing veterans who are serving beyond the uniform. And I'm super excited about our guest, Marine Corps veteran Ryan Pavel. Thank you, Ryan. And I almost said that nomenclature you just told me 10 seconds ago, and I was like, Grandma Sue might be listening.
It
Pavel, go to hell.
works.
Okay, I said it. I couldn't help myself.
There you go. Yeah. Look, I mean, so I was mocked as a kid, right? That was like a kid used that against me, right? Like Pavel and go to hell or something like that in third grade. And so later in life, I was like, you know what? I'm going to own that, right? Like that's how you say the last name. That's a good mnemonic. So, it's owning something which, was initially used against me. So use it freely.
Be proud of your name. Like I said, so if you don't like her, so leave me alone. Literally, so we can both relate there. But I love to kick off the show with some motivation, and I'd love to hear your favorite motivational quote. And as I offer to each guest, you can be my first one to sing it like a cadence.
Ooh,
I'm
like a
speaking.
cadence.
Awesome. Ooh.
That's exciting. All right, well, let me say it and let me see if I can call cadence with it. I haven't called cadence in a hot minute. So the quote is maybe a little bit when you talk about motivational, this might not fall into the typical category I consider to be deeply motivational, right? And so I came across this quote years ago and I think about it often. So it's a John Stuart Mill quote, and it's, "He who knows only his side of the case knows little of that." And that to me is this really interesting framing device of if you only know your side of any particular issue, then you really don't know your own side of it. And so it's this forcing function for me. If I come on, I have strong opinions, or we might come across some of them in this, over the course of this podcast interview. But I think that there is a temptation to only ever drill down on your own side and really get deeply entrenched. But in order to really know how to defend your position, you have to explore the other possibilities. And so to me, that's this continual motivation to explore, to think, to read, to be uncomfortable, right? To put yourself in uncomfortable positions, and then to be able to come back and say, okay, now my original position, yes, I still believe that, or you know what? I no longer do. So that in the fiber of what we do at Warrior Scholar Project and just in my life. So it's an odd motivational quote, but it works for me,
No,
That's where it comes from. Yeah.
I don't think it's odd at all. And I love what you said about, getting uncomfortable because you are a Marine. And I know we are going to be talking about Warrior Scholar Project in a bit, but I was like, oh gosh, knowing how the Marines are, and again, the whole once a Marine, always a Marine. And to me, I feel like Marines always put themselves in uncomfortable situations. It's just like you guys are glutton for punishment, but you all feed off of that. So,
Well,
uh, right.
we do
And
indeed. Yeah.
we're gonna definitely dive into that in a moment. But I'm gonna take our guests back to where you grew up. I think this is such an important aspect about learning about veterans, and I love that you kicked off with that motivational quote. But going back to where you grew up and some of the nomenclature, some of the golden nuggets that you learned from that time, I think really just shows where you launched and where you came from. So if you could tell us a bit about that.
Sure, sure. Well, first of all, thank you for so much for having me on here. I'm excited. I had a chance to be able to listen to a couple of the things that you've recorded before. Marina Rabinek, I'm a huge fan of Marina. She's a
Oh
WSP
yeah.
alum, so I was listening to some of her quotes. And also it's very endearing because in that one, you were both doing Arnold Schwarzenegger impressions. I don't know if you remember that. And anybody who's
Oh
down to
yeah.
do an Arnold Schwarzenegger impression, I want to spend time with.
Oh,
So
fantastic. Well, Marina, I mean, I just mentioned about Mission Continues and us being in Chicago where you're at, and Marina was there with me, and I literally just surprised her. I didn't tell her I got into the program, and it was just one of those things where
cool.
we had never met in person except for one other time. So I love that you listened to that episode.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
let's
I
be
always
buds. I know Arnold Schwarzenegger impersonation, go.
That's right. I mean, yeah, you were doing good to be Java, Dina. That was,
Oh my
this
gosh. Oh
is
gosh. Okay, I know we were not that good. That
I
was
mean,
pretty good.
it was fright. I had to pause, right? I had to say, "Oh my goodness, is that Arnold on the podcast?" No, yeah, but look, so Marina's actually. We'll come to that again. But I do think whenever I do a show or something like that, I like to understand where it's coming from, right? I like to understand the background for it, who else has been on it. Because one of the big lessons, like flashing forward, not just from where I grew up, that so much of life is relationships. Like
Yes.
basically everything distills down not only just into who you know in a transactional sense, but finding people that have some sort of energy which really is meaningful, right? I think that my life's work right now is really focused in a broader sense on civic impact. And to me, civic impact really distills down into people that are willing to be able to work together and roll up their sleeves and get the thing done. And I have found that the best allies in that are people like Marina, right, that are willing to be able to put themselves out there, that are willing to be able to try things, as opposed to taking the easier, quote unquote, easier path, right? The things that are maybe more linear, right? And so I'm a big fan of that. And so yeah, that just it always demonstrates a lot to me when people have already like you've interviewed folks like her. That says a lot about about you and the intent of the show.
Thank
So
you. I appreciate that
I
a lot.
yeah. I grew up in Barrington, Illinois, and I live here again. I live like 50
But I live
mile,
here
not
again.
50, 50 like feet, 50 yards. I was gonna say 50 meters, but who speaks in meters? 50 yards from my high school, which is super weird. Like I never thought that I enlisted at 17 and I was like, get me out of here, right? And now I live back here. But life and family finds a way.
Mhm.
So I grew up upper middle class, very privileged. I'm a straight white guy, and I am very aware of that in my day-to-day life right now. There's this Gen Z leader, Ziad Ahmed, who I met last year, who recently he had this consulting company and he got it bought out, and he when he was doing that, his announcement about that was that, look, this only matters insofar as I can help bring other people to the table, right? And he said, the quote was, he wants to spend his privilege. And that really struck a chord with me because I feel like that's a lot of how I view my own life. I'm very privileged. Like I had a very privileged upbringing, even just how people approach me now, again, like as a straight white male, like in terms of these privileges that I have, I want to be able to spend that privilege. I want to be able to help other people and lift other people up and be very, very aware of that. And so there's something about moving back to my hometown, which actually reinforces that, right? Like there are people that know Chicago, and when they hear Barrington, they think I live in an estate. I don't, right? Like there's like there's tracks right now. They're on the side of the tracks that are like, is affordable, right?
You mow your own lawn. That's what I always say.
That's right. There you go.
Where
That's
the
right.
golf course and the mansions are? It's like I'm on the other side. I mow my own grass.
Exactly right. I own no horses, right? I will never own a horse. Like there are distinctions here, but really, I think that is an important lesson for me, and it was actually really fed into my reasons to enlist in the Marine Corps as well. My father's an immigrant. He had to escape communist Romania and then live in France for a little bit before he came here. He's a physician, and so then he transferred his doctor's license from Romania French license into the US license, just like overcoming adversity, right? Like all of these things, right? And then my mother was born here right after her parents immigrated and they were refugees living in a refugee camp, and then they came here and she was born. And then I'm just a kid, right? I'm an only child living in this upper middle class area wanting for nothing. And my parents both had high aspirations for me, right? My father's a physician, as I said. My mother has her master's in counseling. And I was just this deeply apathetic high schooler, right? Like I wasn't getting arrested, but I also wasn't doing a lot with my life. And so one of the biggest takeaways for me is just like I'm kind of on a path right now to not really do something positive with all of these incredible assets that I have laid before me. And then I got rejected from the school I wanted to go to at 17, which was University of Illinois. The Marine Corps recruiter called. It's 2004. There's some things going on in the world, and I thought, all right, this is my chance. Let's make something of myself here.
Wow, that's so fascinating to me because I mean, that term even first gen American, right? Like I don't even sometimes people don't necessarily identify with that. It's just like that's just how it was. We just happened to come over here and I just happened to be born. Do you resonate with that at all? Like saying being a first generation American, how was that for you? Because probably at home your parents still had some of the traditions that they brought with them.
Yeah. Well, it's so funny. So I'm like, I would say like 3/4 of a first generation American. So technically I'm not, because my mom was born right after my grandparents emigrated from their refugee camp
Mm.
into here. So they like, she was, my grandmother was pregnant with my mom on the boat over here. They
Oh
got
wow.
here, Ellis Island,
Okay.
and then my mom was born, right? So it's just like, I'm like just not, I'm like just over the American. And so my mother was raised here. Her siblings were raised, they were born and like were part of the rep. So like there's very much still a cultural aspect of what from both sides of my family that looked like. Um, and it is very much a part of me, but it took me a lot of time to be able to really figure out how to like again acknowledging when you are privileged and taking things for granted. It's so easy, particularly as a kid, right? When you don't really
Mhm.
have a frame of reference for those things, about like the things that you're taking for granted. But I had some sort of sense of, again, my apathy. I could like not do much. I was not going to be top of the class, but that's fine. I didn't need to be. But there was something about the work ethic that my parents both brought to the table that was really inspiring. My mom went back to school, when I was starting in middle school and then in high school, and she got her master's in counseling and was working as a counselor. My father, retired as a physician, and then 3 days later opened up a private practice again as a
Incredible.
physician. Excuse me, in this like really niche area, very service oriented in terms of the work he was doing. So I think that work ethic from both of them really filtered down into me, and that is in active conflict with being an I'm really, really, really thankful that University of Illinois rejected me, right? Like, had I been accepted there, that was the natural path. Like, that's where most of the people from my high school were going. That's like the flagship state school, right? They were absolutely right to reject me. I would have rejected me as well, right? If I was on the admissions council back in 2004. But it's not the only reason I joined, but for that, I probably wouldn't have enlisted in the Marine Corps, right? So it was really this important event in my life.
It was such an incredible moment because I tend to get the stories about folks trying to, they had an influence, whether their father or mother served or grandparents served, and they grew up knowing about the military, understanding it, or and just in that environment, right? But you're coming from no military background, like you didn't have all of that type of influence. It wasn't a billboard, it wasn't be all you computer. What I know the army, but I don't know
Yeah.
what the Marine saying was back then. But like you were right, like turning on the TV, seeing that we're at a time of war and we're still in the early days, and especially you're talking about '04, so it was still ramped up even then. And for you to knowingly choose of all branches the Marine Corps, and I know you said it was that a recruiter had called you, but was there a thought in there at all about, let me check out the other branches? Or was it just because he just happened to call and there was that eureka
Yeah.
moment?
Look, yeah, it's such an interesting question. So the short answer is no, right? And so there is, I think the Marine Corps, one, I will say, so the Marine Corps is one of their longtime mottos has been the few, the proud, the Marines. One of the
Yeah,
best Onion articles, the headlines I've ever read, was there was a recruitment crisis, not quite to the same depths of what we have now, but around 2006, 2007, there was a recruitment crisis. And the Onion said that in light of that, the Marine Corps was changing their slogan to just the Marines, the few. Um, and I really like that. I thought that was clever, right? Like just cutting to the
yeah.
core of it, right? No, that's it.
Yeah.
The Marines, there's just a few of us, right? That's it. Um, I have since learned a lot about how much pride Marines take in being Marines. But as a high schooler, again, you just sort of have this dim awareness, right? You think like, oh, Marine Corps, right? Like, oh, there's something there. And I think that tapped into this, I wanted to prove myself, right? And so I don't know if another recruiter, say a Navy recruiter, right, Army recruiter, Air Force, Coastie, whatever, if they had called me, I don't know if I would have just gone down that path, because I was an easy sell. So it took 3 calls from the Marine Corps recruiter, right? So there's some value there for me in terms of just like when we think about market, like sometimes it takes a third time and you have to find somebody at the right time. By the time he got the third voicemail, I had just been rejected from U of I. And so
Mm.
it's like, well, all right, Staff Sergeant Salas, right? I'll come meet you. And he didn't have to sell me. By the time that I picked up the phone and talked to him, like, yeah, I wanted to learn a little bit more about the process, but I was in, right? Like it felt right. Not only because I wanted to like take action to kind of not cover up, but to deal with being rejected from U of I, where again, most of my friends, my wife got accepted there, right? And she's from the same area around here, and she's, they rightly accepted her, right? And they rightly rejected me. But I think part of it was wanting to be able to take action, like, see over this. Okay, I can make this decision, but also because it's like, okay, if I'm going to do this, let's do this with the Marine Corps, whatever the hell that means, right? Like, I didn't know, right? But they, there's all this bluster around it. And so I was an easy sell. I was 17. I'm an only child, and so my parents had to sign the waiver, right? Because I wasn't 18, and because I'm an only child, that was an interesting conversation, right? I still don't think I present like a Marine, right? But back then, like, nobody was like, oh yeah, like Ryan's gonna be joining the military, like, let alone the Marine Corps. Nobody would have thought that. Well, my parents, and I was like, hey, I want to join, right? Like, I want to do this. And they had a great approach. They said if I still felt as strongly a month from then, that they would sign the papers. And that was great, right? That really forced me to spend some time to think about it. So it's not just this knee-jerk reaction. A month later, I still felt as strongly, and they signed. Yeah, I initially signed as a public affairs specialist, and I didn't care what they were to sign me up for. That's fine. Then they found out while I was, in the delayed entry program, that they were looking for Arabic translators, and so I took the, DLAB, the Defense Language Aptitude Battery, and had no idea what test. I had no idea what was going on in that test, but they said, yeah, you have the aptitude to be a linguist. So I signed the paperwork. Sure, it's an extra year in my contract, 5 years instead of 4. Who cares, right? I don't know. I'm 17. I don't care. What's a year? It doesn't make a difference.
Right.
So then I was on track to become a linguist.
That's incredible because I literally just I'm still in the reserves now, so we just had to funnel our soldiers through to take the D lab, and they're like, what just happened? Like, they're calling me and they're like, I have no idea. Literally, this is just a caveman made up language, being able to
It's
test whether
nuts.
you know where things go in the sentence.
It's nuts. Yeah. I'm glad that, yeah, it's that it hasn't changed, that it still is this bewildering thing where you come out of it and you're like, I have
Yeah.
never had less confidence in my test results than when I left that test, right? Of just like, I'm sure if you tell me I have the aptitude, sure. I don't know,
It's one of those tests where usually when you test, there's at least one question that you're like, I got that. I know I got that right, but that's not what the deal. That's not the
No.
case. Oh gosh, that's so funny. Takes me back because I just took my language refresher last week. So that's something that I think is incredible because again, had you at that fork in the road gone public affairs, definitely a different path for you.
Right.
But going as a linguist, and I'm sure that's opened up so many doors after that. But would love to hear about, okay, now you're in the Marine Corps, you're standing on the famous yellow footsteps, right? Or the foot's not foot, yeah, right? Like
Yeah.
the
Yeah.
yellow painted
Footprints. Yeah.
feet,
Yeah.
what
Yeah. Yeah.
footprints, sorry,
Yeah.
footsteps, I said footsteps, footprints. Yeah, and so okay, walk me through that you were standing there. What was that experience like for you? First, were you like, call mom and dad right away, tell them, take me back, I made a mistake?
No, I was
Were
really in.
you
I
all
mean,
gung ho?
yeah, I was ready, right? I mean, I think that embracing the mentality of that, I was in delayed entry program for months, and so we did, it was enough for me to make sure that I was really, this is what I wanted to do. And I talked to a lot of Marines.
Great.
They kept having people who came out of boot camp, right, that would come back to the depth for a little bit, and so I got to talk to them. So I knew. I mean, I even asked them to bump up my ship date. I was supposed to ship out in mid-September after I graduated from high school, and then there was an opportunity to go in mid-August, and I wanted that because that gave me the opportunity to leave before all my friends went to college, right? Which actually felt a lot more, again, like agency, like, okay, let's do this as soon as possible. I don't want to just like sit here and watch all my friends go off to school and then I'm here for another few weeks. Like, no, like, send me, right? Like, I want to do this. Let's go. Yeah, boot camp it's not, it's not enjoyable, but there is something about it that really did track with what I was looking for. I think one of the benefits of the military is that you are around people. Every single person, no matter what branch, but every single person in the modern military has, taken the oath of enlistment, or the oath to commission as an officer, and has subjugated voluntarily a portion of their freedom, and that
Yeah.
changes people. And there's something about that that's really powerful, right? Like, there is no conscription right now. There's no draft. And even though, sometimes it's like, go to jail or enlist, right? That doesn't really exist in the way that it used to. So everybody's there voluntarily. And that's not to say that everybody had the same reasons, but it also doesn't much matter because everybody raised the right hand and took that oath. I was speaking to a group of attorneys for Veterans Day last year, and I was reflecting on this. And I was thinking about, like, I actually, was rereading, and I'm very fascinated in the oath of enlistment. There's some like key differences between the oath that enlisted take versus commissioned officers, and those words actually, like the few word changes really actually matter. Um, but I had no idea what I was actually swearing to uphold and defend. I had, again, very apathetic high schooler here, right? And so I'm swearing to uphold and defend the Constitution and obey the orders of the president and all of these things, right? But I never read the underlying document, right? And so, like, that's pretty fascinating. But for whatever reason, I wanted to do that. All the people to my left and my right, my boot camp platoon, right? All of them did the same thing. And it's pure in the sense that it is, at the very junior levels, a pure meritocracy, right? It doesn't matter where you came from. It doesn't matter what privilege you have. It doesn't matter anything like that. It's like, can you do the tasks that are required of you in boot camp? And you will be the extent that you can do those things, and you will be punished if you can't, or you will be part of collective punishment if you can't do those things. And I love that level setting. That's exactly what I needed. That was one of the most foundational aspects for anything for me from the Marine Corps, was just like, start fresh. Doesn't matter where anybody came from. We're all here, and we all got to be able to carry this stupid log from here to here, right? Like, that's it. That's what matters.
Yes, the log. Oh goodness. No, that's so true. And I didn't even think you're the first one, I think, guest on this show that has brought up that the difference between that. And it's such an important key aspect of what we swore to
Yeah.
uphold. And it does change the dynamic. Because I was just having a conversation with a buddy of mine last night about and he actually retired as an officer, and I'm on the enlisted side of the house, but we were talking about us, the generation that served during, the 20-year war, and combat veterans. And now you have this next generation that was born after 9/11 that was doesn't it's kind of fuzzy. They're not really relating to that aspect of why they joined and what those words mean, being in a time of, I guess, we quote unquote peace here. So it's different, and we're getting a new wave coming in, and it is interesting to see that dynamic, even for me, as I'm starting to near on the downward slope of my career in the army. Just seeing these new young bucks coming in. I literally had one come up to me recently. I was trying to ask him different questions about getting his military email set up, and he's like, "Sergeant, I just graduated from high school." I was like, "Oh Lordy!" Like, oh, I don't even know the last time. That was like his response for everything. About I just graduated from high school. I don't know anything. It's like you can only use that
Yeah.
excuse for so long. But it's just blowing my mind, right? That I was just like, "Oh lordy, I've officially become one of the older ones."
Yeah.
But
Well,
it's different dynamic now, as you said.
we even see this. I mean, again, like, just to flash forward a little bit, so to just a very brief description, the work that I do now is leading an organization called Warrior Scholar Project, which is a national nonprofit that takes enlisted service members and prepares them to through a series of academic boot camps primarily, and then there's a bunch of workshops and alumni services. It's not a scholarship program, but the idea is that the education benefits, the GI Bill, VRNE, other institutional provided benefits, the education benefits are wildly favorable to transitioning enlisted service members, and we want them to make informed choices, right? And so
Right.
it's about providing them with, it's really like lighting them up and saying, okay, you have these benefits, make informed choices. You can go anywhere you want. Let's help you build that confidence, and then go spend your benefits somewhere wisely. Don't just go to, like, University of Schmeenix, something that rhymes with that, right? Let's think about other institutions, right? No matter how aggressively they marketed to you. But one of the things that we've realized, right? I've been doing Warrior Scholar Project. I got out in 2010 from the Marine Corps. I got involved in student veteran affairs much earlier than I anticipated, which, again, we can talk about around, like, what my
Could you
transition
remind
was
me how
like.
many years it was that you were in the Marine Corps?
5 years. So
5
2005 to
years.
2010, did a couple deployments back and forth as an Arabic translator, got out, went to school. Which, again, I'm happy to chat more about. But for purposes of this point, one of the things that's really interesting is within the Marine Corps group of students that we serve each year, we've had 2,300 people go through the program. We'll have about 390 go through this year. The changing nature of the military and the separating sort of cohort of transitioning veterans, if you will, it's different, right? There was a period of
Yes.
time that just about everybody had deployed, right? And now that's different. There was a period of time that more, right, a higher percentage had combat experience, and now they don't. And so for us, one of the interesting questions is, does that change anything about how we do what we do, right? And one answer is no, right? The exact same principles for how you propel somebody to success in the transition, the same structure is what you need, no matter where you serve, no matter when you serve, no matter what you did. But on the other hand, there is a difference if you have those late night conversations around things like, post-traumatic stress, right? Like there's a bunch of different reasons that people can have post-traumatic stress, but that can look a little bit different what the triggers are for that. Another example is that there is now a lot more, thankfully, there's finally a lot more attention on, military sexual trauma, right? In a way that like for a while, that just wasn't something which was really actually talked about, right? It was just sort of like swept under the rug. And so now this is because this is more something that people are aware of, that makes it more a topic of conversation within our boot camps. And I'm thankful for that. But we also, as a service provider, have to be equipped to say, okay, people are going to come in, they want to talk about these things. How do we support people with whatever the current, crop of military veterans that are transitioning out? How do we best make sure that they are successful in that transition to higher education? And that changes a little bit.
It absolutely changes. And I think even just this, the crux of does my service, I've spoken to veterans, they don't really identify being a veteran because they feel like because they didn't go to
Yeah.
combat, because they didn't shoot at bad guys,
Yeah.
they're like, oh, I'm not really a veteran. Those benefits
Yeah.
for me, or if I take those benefits, I'm taking it away from those guys guys and gals who really did
Yeah.
do the
Yeah.
combat missions.
Yeah.
And there's a struggle with that. And I don't know if you feel that at 5 years, because I'm not fully at the 20, but I think that there was a point where I struggled with that too, because even for the deployment I went on, it wasn't considered a combat deployment, even though I did
Yeah.
deploy. And so
Yeah.
then you're standing in front of these soldiers that you're like, oh gosh, everybody's got a fuzzy shoulder. And unlike with the other branches, the Army, we have that slick sleeve. Like we actually show whether we have that patch on or not. And so
Yeah.
right away if they've gone or not.
It's out
So
there. Yeah.
it's
I
out
mean, I think
there.
that that's the visual representation of it is such a fascinating point that I haven't thought enough about, right? Like sometimes it is not even a matter of like whether or not somebody decides to disclose that. It's there, right? Like you see it. It is right there. I mean, that's all, in dress uniforms too, the combat action ribbon, right? And sometimes we have people
Yes,
comparing like, okay, well, like how many stars you got?
exactly. Right.
Okay, well, like if that's where we're at, let's take a few steps back, right? So, a couple comments to this. One is that I go back to that point of everybody in the modern military voluntarily subjugated a portion of their freedom and their liberty to be able to serve a cause bigger than themselves. To my mind, that's right. You are a veteran so long as you did that. Warrior Scholar Project doesn't use the VA's definition of veteran. It still is not as inclusive as it should be, right? I understand theoretically why, because they're trying to be able to, in terms of benefit usage, right? You have your reservist, right? You have to deploy it or be activated for a certain amount of time in order to qualify for it. For us, if you went through boot camp, right, you're a veteran, and I think that matters because nobody is forced to make that decision. As a aside, right, there's a whole rabbit hole you can go down about whether or not we should take that for granted, right? And the all volunteer part of it, like that isn't actually something that is a guarantee moving forward. There was a great article co-authored by Jason Dempsey in the Atlantic last year, which was about like celebrate the 50th anniversary of the all volunteer force. A recruitment crisis on our hands, and there are real big things happening in this country
Yes.
and in this world, right? So we should be thoughtful about that. But I think that it really matters that everybody did that same oath. And I think service changes you. Now, my 5 years compared to your almost 20, you have learned invariably a lot more by virtue of having served almost 20 years versus 5. And a lot of what we're talking about here is this notion of imposter phenomenon, right? Like this
Yes.
happens everywhere. Most people call this imposter syndrome. There's somebody named, he's R.J. Jenkins, brilliant guy. He's the director of education for the Columbia Center for Veterans Transition and Integration. Real mouthful, right? I keep telling them they need to shorten their name, but they don't listen to me. But he has this whole theory. And he does some incredible presentations on it about the fact that we should be referring to this as a phenomenon instead of a syndrome, right? It's not like a diagnosis. Okay, you are diagnosed as an imposter. But the
Well, I noticed you
phenomenon,
said that too. I caught on that you didn't say disorder either when you said
yeah,
post-traumatic stress. So I caught on
yeah,
that you said that as well. But there,
yeah.
it's important.
I think the language choice that we use really matters. It really
Mhm.
matters. And so to this one, a lot of people feel like imposters, right? Like, well, I didn't deploy, so am I a veteran, right? Well, I wasn't in combat. Am I a veteran, right? So long as you did that thing, like the threshold to do that is to uh, take the oath, go to boot camp, serve, right? You're a veteran. And part of what RJ talks about with this theory, not to belabor the point too much, but I think it is really important, is that
Mhm.
when you are an imposter, when you feel like an imposter, that actually comes from, it can come from a really healthy of saying like, well, why do you feel like an imposter? It's because you want to belong, right? You're approaching it with a dose of humility. You're not coming in and saying, well, of course I am this thing. Of course I belong in this group, right? Rather, you're approaching it through this critical lens and you're saying like, well, I kind of feel like an outsider, or maybe I really feel like an outsider. And that's because you want to earn your place there, right? And so reframing it in terms of just like, well, there's a healthy aspect to approaching something as an imposter. And when you think about it in that way, it can actually really become a strength, right? You are more hungry to be able to earn your seat at the table if you are approaching something with, as an imposter. To a lot of
Mm-hmm.
veterans as well, right? I am very upfront about the fact that I'm a non-combat veteran, right? Like it's in my public bio for a reason. Some people don't think it should be, but I think it serves an important purpose, right? I deployed, right? I deployed in some interesting circumstances, but I never actually saw combat, right? And so that is an important part where if I say to a civilian, if I say I was a Marine, right, and then I deployed to Iraq in 2008, right, and I just leave it at that, they're absolutely going to assume, you know, rounds are coming down range and that type of thing,
Exactly.
right? And there's like this fill in the gaps model, and that's not true. And that tracks with the veteran culture as well, where we kind of want to prove ourselves. And there's this hierarchy of just like, oh yeah, like how many stars in your on your combat action ribbon, right? And it's just like, well, I don't have one, right? But like, if you want to compare 2 versus 3 stars, that's a problem. So there's an aspect of both helping people who feel like imposters ensure that they feel like they're part of the community, and also for those of us that are in a position that can make others feel ostracized, to really come down to size and say, hey, we all actually served, and that really matters, right? And let's find those commonalities and leverage that as a strength instead of really trying to find the divisions and build this hierarchy and have that track deeply into veteran culture.
I think it's interesting what you literally just happened the other day. I saw a post that a veteran had made about asking about the sergeant major of the army, right? Like the SMA, and does anyone know if the SMA is like has to be combat arms, has to be a combat veteran? And then it got like all of a sudden like dozens and dozens of people commenting, being like, well, the war fighter, so whoever's leading the war fighter should also be, you know, war fighter. So it should be a
Yeah,
combat veteran. Other people are arguing, oh, well, what about the support jobs, the support MOSs? They still matter too. Like, how come they don't get a fair shot to take the reins of the senior enlisted leader? So it was like an interesting conversation seeing happen that I didn't even think about, but those that make it up to the higher echelons having that combat experience, and then everybody else, okay, sit down, chumps yelled and see combat.
right.
So you're not gonna be up here leading the war fighters. So it is an interesting dynamic, but then also for those who did see combat, maybe perhaps like this the Survivors Guild are feeling like they still don't want anything to do. I mean, you come across combat veterans that still don't want to have anything to do with the veteran community, and they are trying to separate themselves from that. And I heard that with a lot of the women veterans that I told you I spoke with recently, and just hearing that, whether we served back in the 80s or we serve now, it's an important conversation having. Like you said, the wording matters. I'd love to go back, like what you said about saying non-combat veteran. You said you did 2 deployments in the Marine Corps, and I was wondering, at that time, did you end up having anybody take you under your wing? I love sort of hearing the little anecdotes from people's time in service, or
Yeah.
were you just kind of thrown to the wolves and said, figure it out?
Yeah. Well, you know,
As
look, it's
as
interesting,
a
right? I mean,
young linguist joining at 17, so
yeah. Yeah. Good luck, right? Go figure it out, kid. I mean, I think that there's a lot of that, right? And I think that's also partly what I needed going back to my apathetic high school self, to be given the raw materials. And then you have to go to a particular, you have, um, I am very cognizant of language that I use to describe the entire veteran community. I think that
yes.
it is actively destructive if we refer to all veterans as heroes.
Mhm.
I think that diminishes what it means to be a hero. I also don't think that we should describe all veterans as leaders, right? I think all veterans have experience with authority, right? Many on both sides of that, both in terms of having to, you know, listen to somebody else's authority and also to have an opportunity to exert authority. I think veterans have the components to be really good leaders, but not every veteran comes out and is a really strong leader.
I'm
And
like, get
so
out of my head, Ryan. You keep coming up with these things, and I'm like, I literally was just having these conversations
let's
this
go.
week.
All right. Well, Mary Kate, we've got more to
It's
talk
about
about.
E4s, right? There used to be the different levels of E4, right? Like somebody could stay as a
Yeah.
specialist, And just because, and there are very good doers. You tell them where to be, when to be, how to do it,
Yeah.
and they will do it. But now we're in this culture, because we're not at a time of war, where it's like, if you don't promote to E5, if you don't put on sergeant, you need to get out. We don't
Yeah.
want you in our army. But it's like, why? They're so good. They're still good soldiers. They're good doers, but they're not meant to be leaders. Not all of us are meant to be leaders. And we
Yeah.
had that conversation. Why did they take that away? Should we bring that back, kind of thing?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that there's one of my favorite things about the Marine Corps, and this is going a bit down a rabbit hole now, but I love that the Marine Corps has that split at E8, right? You become a
Mhm.
first sergeant, right? And the quintessential rank in the Marine Corps, right? Like everybody's had some experience with a first sergeant. Everybody's been, brought um, talking about authority, right? Everybody has fallen under the authority of a first sergeant if you were an
Yeah,
enlisted
eye
person.
contact. We're like, don't make eye contact with it.
And I had great first sergeant. I also had what I would describe as a very ineffective first sergeant, right? A couple different deployments. And then you also have the route to go on the master side, right? Like to the master gun side, right? And the master sergeant, right? And I think that matters, that distinction in terms of I'm either going to, put aside the MOS and the specifics of any sort of any specific duty to be able to embrace the, leader of Marines, right? The first sergeant track all the way up to sergeant major, or I'm going to really double, triple, quadruple down on my specialty. I'm going to be a master of this field and master sergeant, get promoted to master.
Yes.
It isn't to say like master sergeants and master gunnery sergeants are still very much leaders, right? Like it's not as if they aren't doing that. So it's a little bit different than what you're saying at the E4 level, which I think is important that people should. I believe with that very strongly as well. You should be able at an earlier rank. Not everybody needs to be on that same track. Sometimes you just really need people that are subject matter experts who can execute the hell out of a particular mission. Like it's nobody's
And they're
business.
happy there. They're like, we don't want to be in charge
Yeah,
of people.
right.
Sounds
So
awful.
we talked so again, so to flash forward a little bit, I'll go back to your question on deployments in a sec, but the right now Warrior Scholar Project has 23 people full time, right? And we hire about 32 alumni fellows for every summer. So our headcount over the summer is about 55. A huge part of our model is about hiring alumni who went through our programs who are currently in school to come back as mentors for our boot camps, which happen primarily during the summer. That alumni fellow model, right? The fellowship has been really interesting to devise, but the one I think a ton about is the 23 people that I have working full time at Warrior Scholar Project, right? And there's been a lot of growth, right? This is funders that were willing to allow us to build capacity and allow us to innovate and try things. But one of the things that I'm trying to be able to help our team understand is that if somebody wants promotion, right, in the nonprofit space, some of them are veterans, some are mill spouses, some just are, connected to the military community. So this is a broad spectrum of people. If somebody wants to be promoted within Warrior Scholar Project, that doesn't necessarily have to mean you're developing and you are primarily focused on personnel management, right? Like I want some people at Warrior Scholar Project that are just absolute specialists in the thing that they do, right? And it should not be necessary for them to also have to allocate a portion of their time on personnel management in order to be promoted. And I think that that's just like a general misconception in society, right? That like management and growth means personnel management. Some people are cut out for that. Some people are not. My background is also, I'm an attorney by trade. I was at the law firm for a minute. And one of the most absurd parts of how law firms function is that in order to get promoted from a junior associate to a mid-level to a senior associate is you are necessarily managing junior attorneys. And some people are just awful managers. They're great lawyers, but they're awful managers. And with this really wide array of experiences when you're a junior associate, because sometimes you get the luck of the draw and you're dealing with somebody who happens to be a good manager, and sometimes you're not. And so I think that this is, at every institution I've been a part of, this can be a problem where there's an assumption that everybody has the capacity, the interest, the training to effectively manage people. So that tracks actually back to the question around deployments, right? I had some stellar leaders and I had some leaders, in air quotes, right, who had no business, I wouldn't trust them with a ham sandwich, right? But I have to listen to that's a problem, right?
Yes,
because you don't actually have the choice. That's actually one of the assets that I think when I talk about the entire community. So they're not all heroes, they're not all leaders. They've all had to be able to deal with authority in some way. They've all had to accomplish a mission. They've all had to be able to work with a team, right? Likely actually in an under-resourced environment, in a time-constrained thing to hit a deadline and get a mission done. Those are the sorts of things that build resiliency, right? Those are the sorts of things that build this teamwork mentality. So those are the sorts of words I'm comfortable describing.
What
My
about
first
even
deployment,
identifying as a disabled veteran? Like even that, like even for
Yeah, yeah,
businesses where they're like, oh, not only your small business or small women-owned business, you can also put a disabled veteran business, not just a veteran-owned business. But
yeah,
now you get those where it's like, we're doing
yeah,
it for seeing dollar signs, or it's kind of like the reason behind that title as well. And some people
right.
don't want to identify as that.
Some
But
people don't. I mean, there's interesting. There's a few different firms. So disabled owned PE and investment firms. They actually, by virtue of being disabled, they're by virtue of being owned by disabled veterans and formed by disabled veterans, they are part of a group of what can be referred to as these minority investors that then large banks
mhm,
have to partner with a certain number of them. So there's like
exactly.
this, yeah, marketing reason to
There's
be
an
able to do it.
incentive, exactly.
Yeah,
So that
yeah,
changes
yeah,
things too. But do we actually want to that crux of being I'm a disabled veteran? I think
right,
is interesting. Yeah, and going back with your deployments too, because again, if whether we deployed or not, but just because you deploy doesn't mean that you saw combat or that you're a
right.
combat. Just because you deploy also doesn't make you a hero per se. In some of the eyes, like you'll talk to some of the mothers and they say by virtue of us raising our right hand and the sacrifices that we made, of course defining hero differently, but in the terms that we're speaking of it, then like you said, it sort of dilutes like those who actually
It does.
are sort of wearing the Medal of Honor, those who've actually saved
100%.
people's lives. So I'd love to
100%.
hear more about that, about your deployment
Yeah.
experience and
Yeah.
coming home from that.
Yeah. I don't know. It's interesting. I don't think I've ever been asked the question about like whether or not I really had somebody to show me the ropes. I think the answer is no, right? Like that's
Oh,
actually
interesting.
the
Okay, come
honest
on,
answer.
Marines.
Yeah. 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 Um,
It's
no,
because
it's
it's the
really
few, right? Because there wasn't that many
the
of you,
few,
so
right?
like
Exactly. Right. Yeah. So
it's
no,
the
yeah,
few.
yeah, yeah, exactly. Just the Marines, the few. No, so my two deployments are very different in a lot of ways. So they're both to Iraq. They're both to Anbar province. As an Arabic translator, some of the Arabic translators were sent to Afghanistan and told to translate, which they don't speak Arabic in Afghanistan. So I don't really know what the Marine Corps was thinking, but that's Marine Corps logic. So fortunately, I was at least sent to a country that ostensibly spoke the language I was trained in. The challenge, of course, is that you learn what's called modern standard Arabic. So it's the version which they speak on, BBC Arabic or Al Jazeera in the universities, but on the streets, nobody's speaking that. And so you have this lag period. You go through like an Iraqi course before you deploy, but you really take some time for you to ramp up to the specific dialect of what you're going to be translating and what you're going to be interpreting. So I was useless for, I don't know, probably the first 6 weeks in country, right? At least. Um, and we only had, a week or two. We were in a bunker, right? In a Saddam era bunker on the outskirts of Al Taqaddam, right? Which is a large base in Anbar province, about 90 miles west of Fallujah. But because we were signals intelligence, where they had all the antennas and everything positioned, we just lived in this bunker. And there were 5 of us, right? I had a team leader, another translator, a couple other guys in the SIG side to actually process a lot of the stuff, and then 3 contractors. And we were just kind of left alone to be in our bunker and to do our job, which was really interesting, right? Like the culture of that bunker is one that I think about frequently, right? When I think about my deployments, I flash back mostly to just shenanigans in that bunker. I worked the night shift. So, there was one other linguist there, one of the Marine Corps linguists. And so he was on for 12 hours a day. We'd, do a high five and do a quick debrief. And then I would hop on and get in the skiff and I would do my job. And I didn't really see much of the sun for a while, right? Because I was sleeping when it was daylight. And so that was it, right? And so I went into a very deep introspective space. There was actually a lot of isolation on my deployment, right? Technically, I was around a small group of people, but if you're with them all day, every day, sometimes we would, for a while we played Monopoly every day for like 30 days, and that was miserable, right? Because then like everybody knows who's going to trade what. Like it just became like this routine. Nobody was having fun, so we stopped that. Played poker, right? But that I learned a lot about myself, just being introspective and improving my language skills. When you're a translator, right, at least in the role that I was at, most of it is interpreting. Most of it is just translating. Whatever comes in, you're translating and you're parsing those things out. A few occasions, we were attached to an infantry unit and a human unit. And so we got to go and do like actual live translation. And that's where you really learn whether
That's
you know a
really cool.
language. And so
Yes.
those ones I also think about a lot. I've written about some of those things that I was on, those missions. And again, I was fortunate that those were safe. The only time that we know that we were in harm's way is we were, frankly, being idiots, and we were reenacting Iwo Jima with a flagpole on top of our bunker, and then somebody started taking pop shots at us from outside the wire. So that was like that was the closest thing I came to a combat experience, right? Nobody deserves a combat
So
action ribbon for that. But it was isolating. I learned a lot from my team leader. He had previously deployed, but he wasn't a linguist. I learned some things from the human folks and infantry folks, but it was pretty isolating. My second deployment was in 2009 to 2010, and that was right when the status of forces agreement had been signed, and so all Marines had to be out of country by February of 2010. Then, of course, we were back like a year later. So, but everybody was consolidated onto Al Assad and Anbar, one giant base. So it was a different experience because I wasn't isolated, right? I was working part of a larger team, and it was actually, I enjoyed being around people, but I learned a lot about myself, just like being alone for a lot of hours, translating in country and those things in the first deployment. So I had some mentors, right? But there really wasn't anybody that was there that was just like showing me the ropes, who had done the whole thing before.
no, I think it's important to highlight as well because it's not this rainbow and sunshine story that some service members had on deployment. And I'm actually curious too from the family side of the house, whether since your parents no military affiliation whatsoever, did you even get like the care packages and the regular mail from them? Because I think
Yeah.
when you're like legacy children, as I call them, from a long lineage of military families,
Yeah.
you get a bunch of stuff in the mail because they're like, we know what it's like, and so they
Yeah.
send you all your favorites. But did you sort of have that from your family at that time?
Yeah.
Just
Yeah.
out of curiosity.
It'd be an interesting analysis if you could actually get enough data to show whether or not people are more or less likely to get, care packages and those things. I will say that part of my mom's love language is giving, right? And so I got a lot of
Mhm.
care packages. I was very
Okay,
well
you
taken
did.
care of in that way.
That's good.
And it was one of the things that was really meaningful to me is I knew that my father was very proud of me for what I was doing.
Yes.
And he, as somebody, I mean, my father was incredibly smart. He passed away a few years ago. And so, I think about him often, and about, the conversations we would have now around the state of our country and the state of our world. And,
Mm.
we would, as I went through the Marine Corps and as I started to really grow up, we had more of these sort of intellectual conversations. And he and I had very different belief structures on a lot of things, right?
Mm.
Religion, politics. But that quote that I shared at the beginning, right? He who knows only his side of the case knows little of that. So much of that is part of the reason when I came across that quote 5 or 6 years ago that it stuck with me, is because I feel like that's a lot of my patrimony. That's where I was raised. It's just like, okay, if I express an opinion to my dad, I better be able to back that thing. Right.
But this is the lawyer in you, Ryan, that's coming out too. Not necessarily
Yeah,
the
it
Marine
really
side of you,
is.
but this is the Marine side, maybe the competitiveness, but the lawyer in you too is thinking logically. Yep.
I think
Having an
so, right?
argument.
But I think that's why I was drawn. Part of the reason I was drawn to law school, right? And I
Hmm.
also that did turn up the to the nth degree, right? I already had this innate desire to really like think around different perspectives, and then in law school, like that's all that law school is thinking about other perspectives and trying to understand other perspectives from people and judges and all of these things. And so it is very much. I think that is one of the things that I bring to the table is my default is to interrogate my own opinions, right? And to be able to try and understand where somebody else is coming from. In particular, if somebody has a very different walk of life, right? Like again,
Yes,
I'm
absolutely.
very upfront around like what I believe to be my identity. I think about my identity a lot. We talk about that a lot at Warrior Scholar Project, about like the necessity to reflect on one's identity. That's part of a successful transition. And part of reflecting on your identity also means thinking about like what you don't have, like the experiences
Hmm.
I don't have. I will never know what it's actually like to be you, Mary Kate, right? To have your experiences, right? I could learn a lot, right? I can learn a ton throughout all of this. Even, but I'll give you one example, right? I was reading up on Guam, right, a little bit before this, right? Just because like I know an embarrassingly small amount of the history of Guam, right? But it is such an interesting aspect of our country, right? And around like when that became a territory, and trying to put my headset, my mindset in the place of like, if there are people who are citizens, but you can't vote, and you have this non-voting member of a congressional delegation right? Like that imbalance of power, that's the sort of thing that like
Yes.
I'm so fascinated by, right? But it's
Oh,
like the forcing function is
we can
this,
talk. Yeah,
yeah,
we can talk more.
I would love to, but like, but that's the good stuff,
Yeah.
right? Like, I guess that's my point for all of this is I think that like that is one of the biggest parts of any successful transition, but also just a successful life is like finding somebody that has an experience that resonates so deeply in an area that you are not familiar with and like learning from that. It doesn't matter like that, it could feel uncomfortable, but like that's the good stuff. That's where you learn. But we should talk at some point. I want to learn a lot more about Guam.
No, I was like, oh my gosh, yeah, to not segue since we're still on episode, but I would love to talk about that. Have what we call it, virtual cup of coffee. And gosh, if I had known you were in Chicago and had known that had done this a couple weeks ago, I would have
Next
tried to
time.
sneak
Yeah.
away from Mary Beth and try to go
Yeah.
meet up
Yeah.
with you. But
Where
I
are
would.
you? I know we're still recording, but I, whatever. Where are you based?
Oh, I'm out of Maryland. Yep,
Yeah.
I'm
All
here in
right. Well, I'm back
Maryland.
and forth to
So,
DC from time to
oh,
time. So,
fantastic.
all
See,
right,
here
we'll
we
find a
go.
time.
But
Yeah. Any
no, I
listeners,
love that.
whoever's listening, you
Yeah,
can join us, right? We can have a
this is
conversation
how
about
it's
Guam and
done.
leadership. And yeah, that's
Well, the
right.
listeners probably don't know this is literally Ryan and I's first time meeting. You probably wouldn't even know it because we're just having,
Yes.
like two chums just having a conversation here. But no, this is fantastic, and this is what it's all about. And this is why I love that I've, as far as that identity piece really resonate with being in the military community, veteran community. But I
Yeah.
do also struggle with that dual identity of Guam and having my family there who can't vote and vote for the commander in chief, the very person who's in charge of
Wild.
where we go in service. And the fact that a third of the island's owned and operated by the U.S. military, and if the president
Wow.
wanted to make us a military base or a parking lot, he could. And it's interesting. And the transition piece, like the work that you are doing beyond the uniform, as I say, is incredible. And I think that I definitely don't want us to overlook your transition because everybody's transition is different. And it's interesting that you didn't have anybody that took you under your wing that you'd like to give a shout out, because people tend to want to list like a dozen people, and you're like, sorry, Marine Corps, the few they're really out of the few that I had to choose
Yeah.
from, there wasn't anybody there. But I think it's important because it wasn't this rainbow sunshine hunky dory. So I'd love to hear about your transition. What was the moment for you?
Yeah.
You're like, I'm done. I've done my time, my 5 years. I'm still a young guy.
Yeah.
Were you married at that time? Because I think the family dynamic is interesting too, going through the transition with or without
Well,
this.
it's interesting. So I also backing up to that other part of like people to shout out, I should say that there are, when I talk about, I feel like I, even back then, was a very observer of leadership. And I mean that in the sense of who do people respect and who do they not respect? And, the Lance Corporal Underground is just, it's everything, right? Like all that matters is the reputation, right? Like that's the only thing that matters. If you're going to be going somewhere, you rely on the people to your left and your right, right? That are the same rank of you as you, or maybe plus or minus one rank, right? And so if the group of people, if the Lance Corporal Underground really trusted a leader, to me, that was like, right? And so I should say that like in terms of my deployments, I don't feel like I had a clear mentor for my specific job. But on my second deployment, one of the biggest benefits was I had a Gunny Sergeant Monroe. So if he happens to be
There
listening,
you
he is
go.
definitely somebody
Shout
to
out.
shout out. And then also First Lieutenant Zavanovich, who then Captain Zavanovich and stayed in for a little bit. But they were an incredible team, and it was sort of to me it was a really shining example of Gunny Monroe had been in for 15 years. Lieutenant Z had been in for like 2, right? And then she's the boss, she's the CO, and then we had an XO who had been in for like half a year, right? Really interesting circumstance, but they really worked well together. They really had a strong relationship, and it was a good example again of just like sometimes you listen to authority, but the way in which Gunny Monroe could command the respect of people, like he had deployed, right? He'd been part of this unit, but he could also follow orders, right? So like I'm sure that Monroe and Z had some very tense conversations behind closed doors, right? But then when they were presented a uniform front to us, like they were on the same page. And I think that really mattered. So I did get some really positive examples of leadership when I was in. Like in terms of my own transition, in terms of what that led to, in terms of how that shapes everything here. Again, I think that being mindful of who you are and the things that you take away from your military experience really matters. And so when I got out, I knew I wanted to go to school. Like that was something that I was fortunate that I had that. I describe myself as emphatically not a first generation college student, which again is a privilege.
Mhm.
2/3 of enlisted veterans are first gen college students. And so for me, it was a non negotiable thing that I was going to go to school, right? That was just sort of
Mhm.
like, I mean, non negotiable in my own sense, right? Like it was, I knew that I was going to do that. This was part of, again, my patrimony, right? And just sort of like how I was raised that this is what one does. But even with that, my parents, their experience didn't translate to my experience of being a 22-year-old applying to school as a non-traditional student. And so I had one challenge of being a non-traditional student. Most enlisted veterans have that plus being first gen. Um, so I, had my own and I applied to Michigan. They have a strong Arabic program, and I wanted to continue to do that. I got rejected again, so I got rejected at 17. I got rejected when I was 22, and that again was just like oh well, what was all that for, right? Like I thought now I'd be accepted to school. But Michigan said, hey, you still haven't proven you can be a good college student. You need to do some community college. Great advice. So I went on base and enrolled in community college classes. I had a few months left in my contract, and it was after deployment, and our command was too lazy to set up a skiff on base at home, so we just didn't
Oh,
have any work to do. And so I was just able to go and take a couple community college classes, and I called back the admissions office at Michigan, and I said, "Hey, all right, I'm enrolled." And they did a weird thing where in that same cycle that they had rejected me, they conditionally admitted me. So conditional on me getting A's in those two community college courses that I was enrolled in,
mhm.
they would admit me for that cycle to matriculate as a student in fall of 2010. So if ever there was an incentive to actually do my job as a community college student, that was it.
Fantastic.
And it turns out that
Yeah.
by then I could be a student if I had the proper motivation, right? Like I knew how to read, I knew how to write, I knew how to discuss to an extent, particularly at the like on-base community college level. One of the things we talk a lot about at Warrior Scholar Project is there's an enormous jump in rigor from a like on-base community college or community college generally to a four-year institution. And
Mhm.
so I then experienced that in the fall of 2010. I came out of the Marine Corps with some really hot opinions about engagements abroad. I don't think we should have been in Iraq, right? I'm not sure if my service was like a net benefit to humanity. You talked about once a Marine, always a Marine. I sometimes describe myself as once a Marine, always a cognitively dissonant skeptic, right? Like
Is
I
that on a sticker somewhere? I think you should
yeah,
work,
yeah,
you
exactly
should
right. It
brand that.
doesn't, it's not quite as I don't think the Marine Corps is going to adopt that one. But I think
It's
that this
important.
actually taps again into one of the benefits of people that have served in the military, right? That like I will wrestle with this until my dying breath, I think, right? Around
Mhm.
like the value of my service. I am fiercely proud of my service. I'm fiercely proud that I was enlisted. But also in terms of again, I think that it mattered that I was part of something much bigger than myself in terms of service. And at
Yes.
the same time, the work that I did when I was actually in country, and particularly in the intel side, and really thinking about like what's actually happening in the culture of this province where we're at, and like, are we actually moving the needle forward? And now we're looking at it in hindsight, and particularly in 2024, right? Like, did that actually move the needle in a positive way? That's a dicey proposition, right? That's a dicey argument. Um, but wrestling with those things was a huge part of my college experience was then viewing all of those things through the academic lens and reading about these things and writing a thesis on Saddam and about the Ba'athist Party and de-Baathification and all of those things. So it was a sort of a like a moral injury. I think that's I think I do suffer from moral injury. But college was a really important way for me to be able to evaluate that from a lens that I was just here, right? I was safe. I was in Ann Arbor, right? And I'm able to read these things and discuss
Mhm.
and learn.
That's such a powerful thing to be able to remove yourself from the accolades, from the uniform itself and what it symbolizes, or even the patch on our shoulder, and to really think about that sort of challenge. There's nothing wrong with that, like having to that critical thinking and sort of thinking about your identity, your service, because I think it just helps. We don't take that time to process any of that at all. We're just like, we need a
No.
job. We need to get the basic Maslow's
Yes.
hierarchy of needs. And we don't think about that. We're just like, I want a paycheck and I should be getting six figures because I have a TS clearance. But I would, I would love to hear about, because I'm sure you've spoken to numerous folks, service members, and we have some listeners who are transitioning from active duty or from their time in service. what would your advice be to them now? And then we can segue right into the work that you're doing, because I
Yeah.
know it's part of this process.
Yeah. It's one word. My advice is think. Think. Really take the time to think and sit with the discomfort of what it's like to actually really carve out time to reflect and think and plan. There's this book called Atomic Habits by James Clear. Wildly popular book. He sells a copy every 15 seconds, like to give you some sense of like how popular this book is. One of the things that I like about it the most, he has some like really important building blocks in terms of what it takes to form habits. But the most valuable take about how habits relate to our identity. And he has this the thing which, you know, it does kind of fit nicely in a bumper sticker, that every action you take is a vote for the type of person you want to become. And so the idea there is that if you want to build a certain identity, right, you have to first know what you are trying to become. And then you take the actions to get there, right? It doesn't really happen the other way. If you don't have a thought about what identity you're trying to be able to actually build, the actions you take are still helping create, but you're not necessarily in control of that. It's not planned, right? So this is, again, track to like, he thinks about this in terms of habits. That's the whole premise of the book. This is sort of like how you end up eating junk food, right? Like, well, if you're not like moving towards the identity of somebody who eats healthy food, you're just not naturally going to start eating healthy food, right? That like it takes work to be able to do that. And that principle to me is so important. I think that, you know, TAP was useless in 2010 when I got out. Did
Oh yeah, the
literally
transitioning
nothing for
assistance
me.
program. Mhm.
Yeah, exactly. I think it's marginally less useless now in 2024. It
Only
needs to be.
because they're sharing the other resources like yours. That's the only
They
reason why.
should be
Because
doing
I
a
went through
lot
TAP.
more of that. Yeah, but you know, it's not that I'm. Look, I mean, I will always fight for TAP to be better. I think that we have some interesting inroads. We actually have Warrior Scholar Project has a strong partnership with the VA, which I'm very thankful for some of the directions that the VA is going in right now. And the VA's portion of TAP is part of where WSP can help influence that curriculum. One of the challenges within TAP is that the DoD is really thinking about like active warfighters, and DOL
Yes.
is thinking about employment. And then the VA is thinking about healthcare and education, right? It is bizarre that the GI Bill is administered by the VA, I should say, right, as opposed to the Department of Education. But, you know, that's, again, I told you I have some strong opinions about these things, but like there are some interesting challenges. I think the VA has had to overcome or they've had to build a lot of institutional knowledge in an area that they previously didn't actually really have to have a ton of expertise in particular when the post 9/11 GI Bill came out in the 2008-2009 timeframe. So that has come a long way. Those are the sorts of things that I see like real improvement in. But in terms of the experience of somebody who's getting out, I think about like the person who did 1 enlistment or 2 enlistments, right? Which is the primary in the military, right? Is like doing 1 enlistment or 2 enlistments and then getting out. The transition assistance program that they're going to go through is not automatically going to pull them to a place of really thinking critically about what comes next. What it's going to
Right.
do is it's going to put you through, unfortunately, like a lot of like click-through courses, right? It's supposed to start 18 months before your transition. That requires your command to allow you to really be able to incentivize that and like to really be able to do that, which mileage really varies. But then the thought process is really about like your next paycheck, right? So like, and
Yes.
that's fine, right? Like veteran unemployment should be low. It's great that veteran unemployment is lower than national unemployment.
Right.
But if we are only thinking about the next paycheck and we aren't thinking around the role of education or what we should be doing, again, SkillBridge, I think on balance is like I'm a fan of SkillBridge, but mileage really varies. Again, I know a lot of people that have gone through SkillBridge. We've been monitoring it as an organization for a long time. Plays this critical role. And again, for me, I track back to so much of my own experience. I grew up so much when I was a student because I'm suddenly one of 28,000 undergrads, right? And I needed to be exposed. I needed to be uncomfortable. I needed to be able to try and find my community. I needed to think about my identity. And it took me longer than it should have, right? To really be able to find my people. That's part of what Warrior Scholar Project is after, right? Like our boot camps are ungraded, they're unaccredited. Students don't have to spend a dime to be there because we want them to come to us and to be able to feel free to fail, to make the mistake.
This is I,
When
I
they are where they want to
right.
be, they're ready to go.
I have to ask about, and I know we're already coming close to the hour, but I was like, it's such, gosh, talking to you. I know I'm going to end up talking to you after I stop recording
Yeah.
this episode, but I really want to hear about what led you to start this, because I find that you seem, not that there is a type, but the very untypical, what I would think of after 5 years in the Marine Corps, identifying as a non-combat veteran, being the critic and the cynic that you are, that you're like, let me devote my life to starting an organization that helps veterans in the community that I'm so critical about. I would
Yeah.
love to hear what that origin story is. I want to
Yeah.
make time for it on this episode. I
Yeah.
think it's important.
Yeah. Well, I appreciate it. So first of all, point of clarification, I am not a founder of Warrior Scholar Project. I wish that I could take that credit. I got involved in its second year. So they a group of three enterprises veteran. There was somebody who was on his way to OCS and then had a tragic accident, and so couldn't do that. And then
Mm.
just a strong supporter, three classmates came together and said, what if? What if we did this? What if we had something like the Yale experience and we could condense this and we could convince our professors to do it, and we could, find veterans who are enlisted, right, to come and do this thing and experience Yale, and we could change hearts and minds at Yale, and we could do all these things. And they did it in 2012, like beg, borrowing, and stealing for, dorm rooms and every penny they had. And the thing worked. And so the next year in 2013, they were like, all right, well, let's start. That's when I got involved. I had gotten involved with student veteran advocacy. A guy from my old unit was volunteering at the Yale program, and he said, hey, come check this out. So I flew out
Mm.
and saw the thing in action in 2013. And it was like something I had never experienced in my own college life, right? Where it was like, it was this group of tatted up enlisted veterans. They have, Alexis de Tocqueville's, for those of you can't see me, but I'm holding up Alexis de Tocqueville's Democracy in America. Right, had this thick book. They have it in front of them. It's highlighted. They're going toe to toe with this professor. And and it's just like, what universe? Like, where am I? Right? Like,
Sounds
what
like
is?
your universe. That's what I'm so fascinated with it.
Yeah,
You're talking
but
about
I
year two,
loved
and
it.
it's what year for you right now that you've been with this organization? How many years
Yeah,
has it been?
this is like my going on 11 years now, which is pretty wild,
Incredible,
right? So,
incredible.
but so like this is like in a long story medium, I guess, right? Like that aspect of it to me tapped into something of like, what can I do to foster whatever that experience is that I visited in that classroom in 2013? They gave us license to be able to expand it. So we did our own version of beg, borrowing, and stealing for all these things in 2014. We did a version of it at Alma Mater at Michigan. Had some great supporters, right? Some great colleagues that helped make that happen. Great professors. And for 5 years, that was my involvement. While I was going to law school and working as an attorney, I would carve out a couple weeks each year to come back and do this. And then in 2018, I had an opportunity to come on board full time as the COO. I said, yes, let's go, right? I love this thing, whatever I can do. And then in 2019, stepped into the CEO role. To go back to your question, though, I wanted nothing to do with the veteran community in 2010, right?
That's
Like,
not
I wanted nothing to do with it. I wanted to pretend and act like I was just a college student, right?
mm,
I just wanted to do the thing. I was so, as I said, I came out of the Marine Corps hot, right? And I came out of just like, what is this institution? What was my role? Why are we over there? I just want to be a college student. And the thing that I learned pretty darn quickly is that the people that I had a natural connection to, of these, at the now Michigan has like 32,000 undergrads, they only have 104 veterans. So 0.3% of their undergraduate population is enlisted veterans, which is abysmal,
wow.
right? So like, come on now. Not uncommon for a lot of these like flagship schools. They need to do a lot more, and it's in their best interest to recruit veterans, right? Like, there's an
Hmm.
upcoming demographic cliff where there's about to be a glut of 18-year-olds that they can, like, there's a whole bunch of reasons. We could have a whole podcast on this model, right? Around like, and this is part of the work WSP does, is advocating for these changes. But there were 28,000 undergrads. I transferred in, everybody already has their cliques, everybody has their groups. So who
Yes.
do I have a natural connection with? It's the veterans, right? Like, it's the people that are already there that can say like, hey, you should probably take this class, right? Or you should probably not take this class, or come to these meetings. Let's go out and let's get a beer. Let's get pizza. And that was my initial group, right? Like, bonding with student veterans, even though I had this resistance to the veteran community, even though initially I wanted to pretend like I was just going to be like a regular college student, that was inauthentic. Had I gone through something like WSP, had I had somebody that sat me down and said my one piece of advice, like, think, think, don't just act, don't just do the thing. Think about what you want to do. Realized that a huge part of being successful in college would have been both building bridges to traditional communities, traditional college student communities, and also maintaining my connection to the veteran community. That is a huge part of my identity. That is like, I can't help it, right? Like that, the Marine Corps changed me in many, many ways, right? Again, until my dying breath, there will be things like this fierce pride about being a Marine. Like that matters, and the things that I learned. And so that process for me was really transformative. And so then a couple months in, there's like a treasurer position at the local vets group, right? Like, no, fine. Like this has been helpful for me. Sure, I'll be the treasurer. And then a couple months later, then there's a president. Nobody wants it, right? To lead the veterans group. It's like, all right, well, I guess I'll lead the veterans group, right? Like, and I have a decent head on my shoulders. I could figure out how to get engagement up, how to secure some support, how to get free pizza, right? Like work with the university administrators to get free pizza, right? If you put food in a room, veterans will show up. Okay, right? I can crack that, and I can figure it out. And so I just started to get involved, right? I just said yes to some of those opportunities, much in the same way that I said yes to the recruiter when I was 17, right? It took him 3 calls, but let's do this, right? And then, okay, outgoing student veteran leaders, sure, I'll do this thing. With Warrior Scholar Project, right? I graduated in 2012. I was teaching high school for a couple of years in Detroit. And this was 2013 when I went and saw this thing. And it was just saying yes to going out and visiting it. And then they said,
sounds
hey,
like a different battlefield being in Detroit as a teacher. That sounds like a different battlefield.
Hardest job I've ever had was teaching high school. Hardest job I've ever had, by a notable margin. But it's saying yes to those opportunities. And I think that I am unique in the sense that I'm so outspoken around the things that I think can make people uncomfortable, right? In the sense of, again, like this cognitive dissonance. But I think it is important to do that because more of us carry that cognitive dissonance than we are public about, right? Like that is part of the veteran experience. And that's part of what makes veterans so well equipped for civic impact and civic engagement, right? So Warrior Scholar Project is about maximizing your college experience, but it's also about a lot more than that, right? Like this book, I know I'm running this. So this book, right? If you imagine people that are in the Warrior Scholar Project bootcamp model or anywhere, right? And so you have democracy in America, you have the Constitution, you have the Federalist Papers, and you have veterans from across the political spectrum, right? And they're having an appropriate, respectful discussion around the constitutional framework, right? And they're able to do this with the lens of their own service, where they have this shared bond, all of whom subjugated a portion of their freedom. But like they're able to talk about things from the left, from the right, from the center, and they're able to really have discussion. That's where people, going back to that quote of he who knows only a side of his case knows little of that, they're learning what the other person's evidence is. They're evaluating their own opinions. They're making these informed choices, That is what makes them so well equipped for civic impact, to be corporate leaders, to be government leaders, to run for office, to start nonprofits. That's the good stuff.
No, that's absolutely the good stuff. And I love that you bring them together to actually ask their opinion, because on the spectrum of, like you said, enlisted, you do have those that got out as an E4 and they didn't end up leading anybody, and they're just kind of like, nobody asked me what my opinion is. I gave up my ability to have free agency. This is a dictatorship, not a democracy. So nobody asked me my opinion before. I don't know if I have an opinion. And I know that sometimes I still get starstruck because, as I mentioned, even working with top brass or 1-2 stars, and they asked me for my opinion. I was like, me? You want my opinion? I was just going to ask you, sir, ma'am, like, what do you think? I'll just rephrase that. But just having that piece of that critical thinking, I think is so important. I was like, gosh, you're making me want to ask you about like what you thought with the veterans in January 6th, but we will save that for another day. Open up a whole can of worms. But I think that, yeah, but these conversations that need to happen, and I love that you're broadening that and you're spreading that out. And I would love, as we start to wrap up here, how can our listeners get a hold of you? Because your wealth of knowledge, how can they learn more about the work that you're doing, get involved, and where can we help?
Yeah, no, I appreciate the specific question. Look, so Warrior Scholar Project, I will be very clear. There's 2 eligibility criteria. If you are an enlisted veteran that does not yet have your undergraduate degree, and you are interested in higher education, you should come to WSP. You should come to one of our boot camps. You should apply. Our website is warrior-scholar.org. You can fill out a quick interest form, and then you will have a live conversation with a member of our outreach team who can really walk you through, can learn more about you, can tell you about what we do. We can try and find a match. Then you can apply for the full program. It's completely free, right? Big part of my job is raising $5 million a year to make sure that this is free for every veteran that wants to go through it.
That's incredible.
Any enlisted veteran that meets those criteria, we want to serve you, right? We want to be able to support you. If you know somebody that could benefit from that, again, think about this rigorous, intensive experience that can help somebody unlock their potential and maximize their GI Bill, send this to them. warrior-scholar.org, send them that. If you want to get a hold of me, there's a contact us form. You can look at my bio on the website. You can find me there. You can also find me on LinkedIn. Pro tip, if you connect with somebody on LinkedIn, send a little message with your connect request, right? Don't just do the like click connect and then it goes into the ether, right? Say like, hey, Ryan, I heard you on this thing. Let's chat. Let's connect. Okay. I'm much more likely to accept that, right? Than I am. It's just, I have many, we could have a whole podcast on LinkedIn too, right? Like LinkedIn is
absolutely
very, very useful tool, but also, yeah, some things.
And we're not, and I would say we don't all have our sanity either. I say in the veteran community, some of us are a little bit off our rockers. So, just try, just because you're a veteran doesn't mean we're going to be besties. But no, I love that you add that with a little note there. Important.
Yeah. You are the great irony of my life's work right now is that it's all about veterans all day, every day. I'm either talking to veterans or I'm thinking about veterans or building programs to be able to help support veterans, working with this remarkable team. And I lean into that, right? Acknowledging that, again, that cognitive dissonance of the fact that it doesn't necessarily make sense on paper, but that's part of what makes it feel so right. I love what I do. I'm very fortunate to have a job that there's no job I'd rather have, but it's a deeply nonlinear path, right? From the Marine Corps to teaching, to being an attorney, to being in this role. I love it. And so I also like to be able to help support people that are at earlier stages of their career paths and sort of trying to build out, how do you build out where you want to be? And again, think. That is my biggest piece of advice. No matter where you are, spend the time, stop, reflect, and think, and be intentional about your path forward.
Oh, thank you so much, Ryan. That's incredible. You shared so many golden nuggets of wisdom. And I also just want to add for our listeners that, Ryan, you served 5 years. Like, don't discount to our listeners that whether, your rank, how long you served, that you have so much value to add to those coming behind you. Share these resources, share that knowledge. You don't have to be an officer from an Ivy League or a service academy to be the one who knows all of it. Sometimes they're the ones that are knocking on our door for help too. So it's just important, just take heed what Ryan said. I love that aspect. Think, stop for a moment and think. And, again, connect with Ryan. And as we say on Veteran Voices, do good, pay it forward, and be the change that's needed. I'm Mary Kate Saliva, your host of Veteran Voices, and we will see you all here next time, where you can get your podcast from the Supply Chain Now family of podcasts and wherever you get your podcasts from. And again, a shout out to the Guam Human Rights Initiative, nonprofit near and dear to our heart, guamhri.org. And again, check out Warrior Scholar Project. We will see you here next time. Take care. Thank you again, Ryan.
Thanks, Mary Kate.